When you think about your career now, is it any different to the one that you imagined when you first started out? Or have you started to feel stuck and maybe even bored? And more importantly, is your identity so wrapped up in what you do that it feels uncomfortable, even asking yourself those questions? What we want from the second half of our working lives is often very different from what we wanted when we started out. And for me, that's nearly 27 years ago. When we're younger, we tend to crave recognition and status and often strive for seniority or leadership roles. But we often find that, especially within healthcare, that a succession of promotions has led us further away from the work we were so excited to do in the first place. This week, Dr. Mark Schreim, author and surgeon, is back on the podcast to talk about medical careers in midlife. If you're starting to notice that you're not getting quite the same meaning from your work as you used to, it might be that you're on what David Brooks calls the second mountain, where you're no longer chasing status so much, but looking for a way to help the next generation or do something that offers purpose and meaning over recognition. So whether you're at that midpoint in your career or you're starting to wonder whether what you want now will in fact serve you later in life, Mark has some great advice to get you unstuck, reconnect with what's really important to you, build a career that's sustainable and which offers purpose and meaning.
My name is Mark Schreim. I am a surgeon by training. I'm the editor-in-chief of BMJ Global Health. I've written a book called Solving for Why, and I'm particularly interested in how we as healthcare providers, healthcare professionals, make big career decisions.
So I think this is very pertinent to our listeners, either listeners like me who are in the second half of their lives of their careers, or people that are maybe coming up to them and thinking, well, will I always want to be doing this? But let's start off with, when people come to you typically, what issues and problems are they bringing?
The majority of my clients are in healthcare, physicians, nurses, and other allied health professionals, including people who are not officially in healthcare, but are carers for others. And caring it's a tough job. It demands a lot out of you. And so a lot of people end up finding me because they get to a point where they're burnt out and they get to a point where they're done with what they've been going through on the day to day, but they still have this caring instinct in them. And they're not exactly sure how to navigate, I still love seeing my patients. I still love being in the operating room, but I kind of hate the day-to-day and kind of hate what it's done to me over the last 20 years. I had a client once say to me, this client is an OR nurse. The way she framed it was, I don't get it. I've been an OR nurse for 20 years so that I can continue to be an OR nurse for another 20 years. So that kind of, I'm halfway through. I'm kind of stuck. It hasn't been the ride that I was promised. And what do I do? How do I balance all these things, my calling, my identity, and also wanting to live and exist in a non-burnt out way?
So is burnout a big reason then why people are coming?
I think burnout, yes. Burnout is a big reason why people end up coming.
Increasingly, I'm thinking, obviously that's what people present with. They say they're burnt out, but it's like saying they come to you with knee pain. Yeah, there's pain in their knee, but what on earth has caused that? And unless you start to look at the cause, and that can be caused by all sorts of things. And so often we're just trying to heal burnout. We're trying to treat the symptoms. We're not looking at the cause. So are people not enjoying the actual sort of meat of their jobs? Is it everything else that's getting on top of them? Or do you think it's something a little bit deeper than that?
Well, I think it's both. You definitely have people who will say, and I'm one of these people. I love being in the operating room. I really, really like the act of operating and seeing patients and all that. I personally shut down my U.S. practice 7 years ago. I don't see patients in the U.S. anymore because I hated everything else around it. So there's definitely a subset of people, and it's a fairly large subset of the people that I work with who have that, who are like, yes, I still want to be a healer in some way. I still have this value in me. I still have this identity, but this is not what I was promised. And then you've got another subset of people who are fully done with it. All of it is over. Maybe they liked it when they were 26. Maybe they never liked it, but just put on a front. But whatever, now that they're 46, they've decided that is not the direction that they want their life to go altogether. They want to make a significant shift. I use this example often. I early in my coaching career talked to somebody who wanted to leave medicine and open a goat farm. And so you get all of that, that whole spectrum.
And do you find that the issues that you're dealing with in people sort of entering the second half of their lives and what they're wanting is very different from, say, if you were doing some career coaching with some of the younger people?
I do think so. I think a couple of reasons. First of all, if you've been in healthcare for 20 years or so, you've seen basically everything. And you've seen the evolution of the healthcare system in whatever country that you happen to be in. And then there is a big shift that happens in people around the middle of their lives. We know it as a midlife crisis, which we're talking before we started the recording, that phrasing is just so harmful also, that it's a crisis that must be managed. But there's research, there's evidence that people go through a big shift in the middle of their lives. So you get both of those sort of kind of layered on top of each other, that the conversations that we have when we're in our 40s and 50s and early 60s are very different than the conversations that we would have had when we were in our 20s, deciding which specialty do I want to go into, or do I want to go into medicine? One of them, do I want to go into medicine versus do I want to stay in medicine? Very, very different conversations to have.
I'm very interested in this thing about actually you would have liked to just do the operating and carry on. Is that really true? Like if someone said to you in the US, you could work 5 days a week, purely doing the operating and nothing else, would you not get a bit bored?
Yes, undoubtedly I would get a little bit bored. There are certain people, and one of my fellowship directors was this sort of person, for whom getting the absolute minutia of an operation down and slightly faster every single time, or slightly better every single time, that drives him. That's not me. That's not my personality. So I probably would get a little bit bored. The problem, though, is that what I was offered as a full-time practicing clinician to, add some spice to the boredom was not fun. That it was the billing, and it was the medical legal, and it was the profit and loss, and it was the health insurance interaction. So yes, I would have gotten a little bit bored, but I don't think the solution that the American healthcare system presents is all that good either.
Yeah, I think you've helped me articulate the thing that was niggling at me, because I had the same issue as a GP. I got really bored just seeing the same old again, although the workload was really high. So it was a combination of bored and stressed. But I know that I need something else to stimulate me. You need to grow and develop, and every human needs to grow and develop. But then you've got this problem that growing and developing, so in healthcare, for example, is often becoming clinical director, becoming director and getting these management and leadership responsibilities. And then you hit like midlife, and you've seen that this career trajectory that you've been on is, I used to sort of run the professionalism course, and then the next step would be to go up here, and then the next step here. But I didn't want to do that, but I still wanted to learn and develop. So then suddenly I've got the only career path that seemed to be open to me was like this, but I knew that was not what I wanted, but nor did I want to just keep seeing patients because I was finding that boring. So then I was stuck, and that was my conundrum. Is that familiar to you?
Oh my gosh, yes, 100%. Let me say two things here. I've gotten lucky in that I've gotten to construct a life in which my clinical work is, to a large degree, the operating and the taking care of patients without the other stuff that's around it. And I do that because I do some global health work, and I do that 12 weeks a year. I'm operating 12 weeks a year, and I get my operative numbers, but also I get to be able to do one of the things that I really love to do. I was also on a similar path where the only real advancement, so to speak, in medicine is to become a director, become a chair of a department, become a CMO, et cetera. And I was the chair of a department. I was a chief medical officer. And that's basically the only career path that we are given to broaden ourselves. And so people like you and me, we end up doing things that are outside of medicine to broaden ourselves. But at least when our generation was training, that wasn't necessarily looked upon very well. You've left medicine, in inverted commas, to do this non-medical thing. Are you not a serious surgeon? Are you not a serious GP? Do you not care about your patients? When I was CMO of the charity that I work with, I was in that post for about 3 years, and the COO of the charity, so one of my colleagues, came from the mobile phone industry first. And then he moved to aviation. And then he moved to be the COO of a medical charity. And I think about his career path a lot, because in that sort of world, he comes from the project management world. In that sort of world, it's totally normal to take your project management skills and go from mobile phones to aviation to healthcare. But for us in medicine, oh my gosh, if you get out of medicine, there's something wrong with you. We have this push that you must stay in, that the only path that you can have is in medicine.
That really rings a bell. It's that identity thing, isn't it? It's very difficult for us to imagine an identity outside of medicine. And people feel a lot of shame when you think about not even just leaving, even just like, well, for a day a week, I might do something else. It's sort of like, and I think colleagues shame you as well, or actually nobody can shame you except yourself. Colleagues criticize you and sort of talk about deserting a sinking ship or being too commercial or that sort of thing. But, we need commercial people in healthcare, quite frankly, to, innovate and stuff like that. But you're right. Why is it that we encounter the shame and criticism in healthcare, yet in any other industry? But you've just moved to a different role. There's no dramas about that.
Yeah. And I think you said, you hit on it in the first thing you said, which is that I've been calling them the identity professions. There are professions in which our identity is our profession. Doctors, lawyers, clergy, you are a priest, you are a lawyer, you are a doctor. And that is so much harder to leave. A good friend of mine is a ballet dancer here in New York City. And she wrote a book in which her last chapter kind of meditates on leaving ballet, because, ballet is hard on your body. And so when you hit your 30s or maybe early 40s, at some point, you no longer dance professionally. And that chapter is sort of a meditation on who am I without this? And it's something that I had to go through as I was deciding to shut down my US practice. It's something I used to compete on an intense sport called American Ninja Warrior. And it's something that as I moved away from Ninja Warrior, I also had to consider, like, who am I without my white coat? Who am I without ninja? Because those things become your identity in a way that perhaps some of the other professions don't necessarily become your identity. And so then we feel the internal shame that I was called to be a doctor and now I'm leaving it. Is there something wrong with me? And there is the external pressure from our colleagues also that we need to stay, because, oh my gosh, those people who leave, there's something wrong about their commitment to their patients. I mean, that's part of what people have to wrestle with in these midlife transitions. It's what I had to wrestle with. It's what my clients have to wrestle with is, does this mean, does moving, does changing mean that I am somehow less impactful in the world, that I somehow have failed what I was put on this earth to do? These sorts of phrases we hear all the time.
So how do you help people wrestle with that? And I'm thinking now, not just for people that want to leave, but actually there might be people that are still working as a doctor, another senior healthcare professional, that aren't going to leave, but actually they realise that their identity and their significance is coming from their role. And they realise it'd probably be a bit healthier for them if they manage to loosen that hold on them.
What I'm going to say is, when I first heard this, like, truly, I don't want to say depressed, but like truly made me down.
Right. Brace yourselves, everyone.
Yeah, brace yourselves. But then it was really freeing, honestly, which is, I do not know my great-great-grandfather's name. I don't think I even know my great-grandfather's name. 100 years from now, very likely, nobody will remember Mark Schreim or Rachel Morris. And that's depressing for those of us, especially who feel like we have a calling in this world. The likelihood that we will be remembered for the work that we did is low. And so coming to grips with the fact that our legacy, so to speak, is likely to be short-lived was depressing, but also becomes really freeing. That I'm putting this pressure on myself that I must be this amazing, impactful person in the world. But really, that pressure is coming from me. The pressure is not necessarily coming from the world. It may be coming from my colleagues, as we talked about earlier, but that's also unhealthy.
So how do we then change that? Because presumably these are really deep-seated, deep-rooted stuff. Do you need to spend hours and hours in therapy?
I mean, you can spend hours and hours in therapy, and I'm a full believer in therapy. At the same time, part of what drives us into these things is a value set. It's a set of values that we had and have. when we're 26 and when we're 46 or 56. What we give ourselves less permission to do than maybe we should is for those values to change. Significant evidence that our value sets do change over the course of our lives. Just as a very specific example, my values around public health changed because of my experiences working in West and Southern Africa, right? And my experiences have shifted the way that my values align. And that's what happens. I mean, our values are not set in stone to a large degree. They are malleable. And yet again, as physicians, as healthcare professionals, we feel like the values that we had at 26 should remain with us for the rest of our lives. And some of them do. Like, I really do value being able to use these skills to be a healer. But some of them don't. Some of them completely leave. And then I use this analogy with my clients of a sound board, a sound mixing board. If you've been to a concert, then you've seen the sound person in the back moving these knobs up and down. That's what our values do too. They kind of realign themselves, and one of the knobs maybe turns up more as your kids are born. Perhaps the value of being home more goes up. And then maybe as they leave for college, perhaps the value of, travel goes up. Our internal values change. Again, we put this pressure on ourselves that mixing board must stay static for the entirety of our lives, but it actually doesn't. It's allowed to change.
What values typically are changing along the way? There's that thing about wanting to be home or wanting not to be home. Are there any particular values that people tend to really hold on to at work that are completely different in their late 40s, 50s to when they're in their 30s? I mean, off the top of my head, I'm thinking, probably that whole having to achieve a lot.
So this is old psychology. This is Erik Erikson back in the I want to say 1950s, but don't quote me on that. Developed these stages of psychosocial development over the course of the entire life cycle. So a lot of the study at that point had been, what are the phases that babies go through? What are the phases that children go through? But he developed this stages of psychosocial development across the entire life cycle. And each stage of psychosocial development is characterized by a crisis that must be managed. And if that crisis is not managed, then the next stage of psychosocial development becomes harder to manage, right? And so in his framing, the crisis that has to be managed in your late teens and early 20s is identity versus confusion. Who am I? What am I? I need to establish who I am in this world. And then in the 40s to 60s, the crisis that you have to manage is generativity versus stagnation. Stagnation, we understand. We know we as healthcare providers sometimes feel the stagnation. Generativity, in the way that he envisioned it, is kind of legacy thinking. What do I do? How do I leave behind? How do I train the next generation? What is the legacy? I know we talked about our legacies will disappear in 100 years, but what am I passing on to the next generation of people? So already when we're younger, when we're establishing our careers, the thing that's driving us is establishing our identity. But then by the time we get to our 40s to 50s to early 60s, we should have established that. And it's okay for us to let go of that because we no longer have that psychosocial crisis. Our crisis now is we could stagnate or we can build into something else. And I think this is super important for people who are in our midlife because, again, if you don't manage that crisis in that particular stage, well, you have a harder time managing the next crisis. And the words that Erikson uses for the next crisis are a little terrifying. The last stage of life, he says, is 65 and older, and the crisis you have to manage there is integrity versus despair.
Wow.
And yeah, right. Wow. Like despair is a hard one for us to think about ending our lives on, and so that's why I think this midlife shift is so important to manage because we have moved into a different part of our lives than we were in when we went into medicine or nursing or healthcare. The author Richard Rohr calls it basically calls it the second half of life in his book Falling Upwards. And what we're trying to do as we become the community elder, so to speak, is very different than what we were trying to do as we were trying to establish our identity.
That's interesting because I was thinking earlier when you came on, I was thinking, why is it that so many people do, when they make their midlife transition, do train as coaches and, sort of consultants want to help people? Is it just because they can't think of anything else to do? But actually, it's not, is it? Because if you look at this generativity, that's all to do with, yes, supporting other people, helping other people come along, not necessarily being about, I've got to leave this long-lasting legacy, but it's actually, how can I help other people and share my learning? And that is really nice to think about that. So when people are sort of thinking about what else can I do, either within my role within medicine, or if I'm going to leave and do something a bit different, think you would probably enjoy a job where you are more in that sort of wise elder role, as apart from perhaps doing the doing and wanting to achieve a lot just to boost your own, ego. You actually probably will be happier doing the generativity thing. And maybe that's the way we've been designed, that actually, we don't have very much, I'm so much tighter. My 50th is later this year, and I really notice how much less energy I have. I just can't do as much during the day. So actually, I'm now much more suited to sort of being like a wise old owl sitting on a perch advising people, although my children would fall about laughing if they thought that was how I was describing myself, than I am just actually getting on and doing the job. But I don't know how much we value the generativity stuff versus the doing bits.
Right. And we don't. And I will say, you said something in there about when you're younger, you're trying to do all the things for your ego. Yes, ego can definitely play in there, but that's also the stage that you're in, is developing your identity. Like, you are developing your mark in the world. And yes, that shifts. And I think you're right that we don't necessarily value that. Even, and again, I'm American, so I'm going to speak from the American healthcare system, just the way that doctors are paid does not value that mentorship role. Like, I still need to produce the same number of RVUs as a 55-year-old surgeon as I needed to produce as a 35-year-old surgeon, if not more, because otherwise my profit and loss statement is off. And so, no, we don't pay, really. We don't pay out people's time to do the mentorship. We just sort of expect that it happens on top of continuing the thing that you were doing 20 years before. So yeah, I think you're right. We don't necessarily value that wise old owl, as you said.
Whereas the leadership thing, if you have a leader who is really very skilled at coaching and mentoring and things like that, you've got the most fantastic leader. And I think we don't value it ourselves. We seem to think that leadership takes, like, I don't know, in the NHS, you might get paid like 4 hours a week to be the clinical lead for your department. Then you've got to keep going with your day job, or you feel guilty if, well, actually, I'm feeling guilty because actually most of my time is spent on leadership. But I'm saying I would much rather, you're much more valuable to your hospital probably now, spending more of your time leading the department and leaving the doing to the younger people because of the experience that you've amassed and the time taking to think of it.
Let's also talk about the fact that we don't value it enough to train people in it either. The number of clinical leaders who are clinical leaders simply because they were good clinicians, it's massive. And so we end up putting people in situations in which they feel underprepared, but we expect the same high standard of performance as they had when they were doing the thing they were prepared for, right? We were in training for medicine for whatever it was, a decade and a half. So we had a lot of preparation for how to cut and sew. But then you move into leadership and it's just like, okay, go, good luck, improve your department. And we don't train them for that. And so that also leads to the burnout, because then you've got these high performers who are thrust into situations that they're not prepared for, and they feel themselves falling down on what they're asked to do.
And they also feel guilty for not spending time on the shop floor. They feel guilty for the leadership time, which is madness really, when they're so valuable. So you've got people coming to you, they're entering the second half of their life, they're having this sort of identity crisis or whatever. What else do you do with them that really helps them with this transition and work out actually what should the second half of my life look like?
So my PhD is in the science of decision making. And I think the other thing that we struggle with is that we don't necessarily have good frameworks, good methods, good training in how to make big decisions in our lives. We're so good as clinicians at making decisions for other people, sometimes very impactful decisions for other people. But then to look at ourselves, nobody talks to us about how we can make these big decisions for our own lives, because big decisions are fraught with a whole bunch of uncertainty. I say this all the time to my clients, no decision is made under certainty. Every decision is made under uncertainty, because if there was certainty, it wouldn't be a decision. So for making these big decisions, small or big, for making these big decisions in our lives, we have zero way really of conceptualizing or taking into account all this uncertainty that our identity and our values and all the things we were talking about earlier brings in. So I work a lot with my clients on that, on how do we actually surface all of this uncertainty? How do we deal with this uncertainty? How do we describe it? How do we bring it into our decision so that when we're done, we can look back on it, on that decision and say, okay, with everything I knew at the time, I made the best decision I could.
It's really hard, though, to make the decisions about your future self when you're not that self, but also you don't know what it's going to be like when you're there. A really silly example, we're wondering about moving house at the moment, but we don't know whether we want to move further into town or whether we want to move out of town. But it's a really big decision and you're not going to know until we're there. And what if we make the wrong one?
Well, there are two things I want to say to that. The first is absolutely, you're right. Transformative experiences lead to personal transformation, but they lead to something called an epistemic transformation. You don't know what you don't know, and you cannot know how you will feel after a big decision on the front side of it. Like, you cannot, sitting here, you absolutely cannot know how you will feel if you decide to move closer into town or out. So to some degree, you're never going to answer that question. So fixating on trying to answer that question, all it does is it keeps you stuck. There are a number of different ways to manage uncertainty. One of them is to, and I think a maladaptive way to do it is called reduction. It's to try to reduce the uncertainty all the way to zero. And that just never works. And so people who have that tendency towards uncertainty just continually try to gain more information about the uncertainty until they're satisfied that it's down to zero, but they never act. So the other thing I would say to that, though, is we have a remarkable psychological immune system. We are remarkably adaptable to situations that we think are going to be terrible. There's a fascinating study in which the authors looked at college students and asked them how happy they would be in the future if they were assigned to an undesirable dormitory versus to a desirable dormitory. And the answers were what you'd expect. The people who thought they would be assigned to an undesirable dormitory thought they would be much less happy than those who, but then a year in, their happiness levels were identical, whether they were assigned to a bad or a good dormitory. We are so good at this. Our psychological immune system is so good. We are so adaptable that you decide to move closer into town. There are going to be good and bad things about it. And eventually, a year in, you're going to be just as happy as you would have been had you decided to move further away from town, because the good and bad will balance each other out.
That's encouraging, but also quite depressing, because presumably if you get someone coming to you and they're pretty miserable now, they can also reach the same level of misery in a new life that they've decided to do.
Such a good point. I think what I'm trying to say here is that our affective forecasting is what the authors call it. Our affective forecasting is pretty bad. We are mostly okay in knowing whether we will be happier or sadder with a decision. We're mostly okay with the direction of the affective, positive or negative. We overestimate, however, how big the emotion will be and how long it'll last. Another study of professors going up for tenure, again, pre-tenure decision, were asked, how happy or sad will you be if you get or don't get tenure, and how long do you think that happiness or sadness will last? And routinely, they overestimated both. So yes, the professors who got tenure were happier than those that didn't, but for less time and less intensity than they thought they would.
Gosh, that is really interesting. Okay, so you're not going to know unless you try it, but you often overestimate the effects on your happiness or sadness, as it were. Okay, so how do people make these decisions then? How do you help them? What's the techniques that have the biggest value for you that you just come back to again and again and again?
So broadly, in a 50,000 foot view, we start with the thing that we were talking about in the first half of this podcast, which is the values. we actually build someone's mixing board. We figure out, you pick your five, we go through exercises in which your 5 top values get kind of surfaced. And then you build that mixing board. Which one at this point in my life do I think is number 1, number 2, all the way down to number 5? Very specifically though, which one do I think? So I'm trying not to hear what other people think it should be. And at this point in my life, not when I was 18 and choosing to go into medicine. So we build that. And then there are, I use 5 different decision-making frameworks, and we match them to the person, but frameworks that are very kind of risk-taking, frameworks that ask, what's the best that could happen? Frameworks that ask, what's the worst that can happen? And let's protect ourselves against that. Frameworks that bring in regret. What happens if I make the wrong decision? How much will I regret it? And let's minimize that regret. So we find the framework that is the most, that kind of speaks to the heart of the person the most. Then we can combine those values that they've elicited with those frameworks that take into account the uncertainty of how much regret I will have. And what that does is eventually there's some math behind it, but it bubbles to the surface what I think the next stage of the next step should be. So now that I've put everything together, it really is looking like I should go into cabinet making. Again, this is actually a real example. I should go into cabinet making. Then we take a really important pause and we ask, now I need you to envision yourself at 86, looking back on your life. And I know this sounds morbid, but I actually have my clients write their obituary. What do you want your obituary to read? And how does this decision fit in with that? So we kind of future test their decision, and we also reality test their decision. So you want to go into cabinet making. Let's get you in touch with some cabinet makers. Spend a couple of days, spend a weekend shadowing some cabinet makers. What does the day-to-day of cabinet making feel like? And then finally, the last step that we do is once we have surfaced the decision, we've taken into account the values, we've taken into account the uncertainty, once we've future tested and reality tested the assumptions, then it's time to act. And this is where a lot of people get stuck. Is super cool to think about a decision in the hypothetical. But okay, now I am going to be a cabinet maker. What does it take to do that? What's my financial runway? How long do I have to make this cabinet making a success? What are the medical legal consequences of me shutting down my practice? How do I brand myself? All those, that actual step by step. I think one of the reasons that people stay stuck is because making a big shift seems so insurmountable. And once you break it down into small steps, in May, I need to do this. In June, I need to do this. Then it becomes, it's bite-sized. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. You actually take that first step.
I think that's where doctors really struggle. It's like, it's such a big deal to do this. So that's really, really practical. Do you think it really matters what anybody does if they get other things right? Because I've got this theory that there are these sort of core needs that we all have, and I call it your North Star needs, which is to feel good, to have good, deep relationships, find meaning and purpose in life. But my theory is that if you've got all those things in your life, actually what you're doing probably is not going to make huge amounts of difference.
Yes, I agree with you. And I think it's super interesting that you split out meaning and purpose and work. Because that's another thing that we as healthcare professionals tend to combine those two, that we must find our meaning in our work. And that's not actually true. The number of people who don't find their meaning in their work far outnumbers the people who do. And we, I think, need to really come to grips with the fact that it's okay that your meaning is something else. It is okay that taking care of patients is a job that you do on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 8 to 5, and then you find your meaning in your cabinet making. Totally okay to do that as well.
I think it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because I know that a lot of the burnout research shows that purpose is a really powerful antidote to burnout. However, and I think we talked about this in the last podcast, Mark, is that I've looked at people that find a lot of their meaning and purpose through their work, or put all their meaning and purpose into their work, and they get burnt out even quicker. Because if you genuinely think your job is to save the world, and you do that through being a doctor or a priest or this or that, then actually when you're not doing it, you're not fulfilling not just your purpose, but you're poor all these souls that are unsaved or whatever. Now, that's a huge amount of pressure, and that just feeds into the whole identity and significance thing as well.
Yeah, and I do think we talked about this last time. The intersection between purpose and burnout is not a clean, straight line. It's not that finding your purpose leads to less burnout, because it might actually lead to more burnout.
Yeah, I think sometimes it really, really does, particularly in healthcare. And so, yeah, no, I really love the concept of the zone of genius. And Michael Hyatt describes that, where you're doing what you love and also what you're good at. So it's finding something where you've got your skills, but you also enjoy doing that. And that can be in paid work or out of paid work. And I was listening to a brilliant audiobook by one of my favourite people, Rob Bell, who does the Robcast. And I'm sure you come across Rob Bell before. And he was just talking about the fact that, you know, if you find something here that's no one's really going to pay you to do, but it really gives you a lot of meaning and purpose and you love doing it, then great, find some work that's going to pay your bills to enable you to do that. But we always think, oh, work has to have all this meaning and be really significant. Actually, if you've got enough money to exist, then go do that other thing.
Yeah, there's a concept, and actually I have it at the end of my book. And the more I've thought about it, the more I think it's an incomplete concept. But there's a concept that had a lot of cachet in the public discourse maybe 5-10 years ago called ikigai, the Japanese concept that what you should be doing is what you're good at, what you can get paid for, what the world needs, and what you love. But I think what you're saying here, which I agree with, is that we have this presupposition that one thing has to do all four of those things. But it's not. You need to have all four of those things in your life, but they don't all necessarily have to come from one thing.
Yeah, I think people get very hung up on what the world's going to pay you for and what the world needs. I mean, you know, in an ideal world, we'd all be contributing greatly and everyone would pay us well for doing that. But in a real world, it doesn't. And then you see other people doing absolute crap and getting paid loads for it. You know, you just look at the influencers who, like, you know, what are they doing? That's not meaningful or worthwhile, but they're getting paid so much money. So if, you know, then you get your worth from what you get paid. It's just ridiculous. And then, or we try and bend what we really enjoy doing into what people are going to pay for. So the market forces, or people even don't know that they need it. And that's when I think you then start to feel like a failure, because people won't pay for it, or maybe people don't need it, but you still love doing it. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Right.
We're aligned here that we don't necessarily need to bend what we're doing to what the world pays for. We need to find an overall portfolio of our lives that addresses all four of those things, or in your analogy, all five of the core needs, the North Star needs. And that, you know, when we look at romantic relationships, we feel like one person has to provide every single need in our lives, and that leads to a lot of stress in relationships. We're doing the same thing with jobs. That one thing that we do has to provide all of the North Star needs that you're talking about here. And that puts too much stress on the job too.
I don't really know any job that can really do all of that. And it takes it away from, you know, I once did it was called a performance diamond with a senior consultant. And it was a way of marking how well your job was doing in terms of purpose, achievement, recognition, and growth or something. And so he marked himself a lot of achievement, a lot of recognition, a lot of purpose, but enjoyment pretty low. And then I said, well, what would you want it to be? And he put his achievement and recognition, he actually reduced the amount. So I said, well you want less recognition and achievement? He said, yes, because look how much it's pulling down my enjoyment.
And this goes back to the conversation we were having before about Richard Rohr and Eric Erickson, that when you're in your 20s and your 30s, achievement and recognition is something that drives you because you are trying to figure out that identity crisis. But once you've figured out that crisis, it's so common for people to retreat and to say, I don't need this anymore. I've done it. You know, I've done the thing. In your example, I've become the clinical director, and it wasn't what I wanted to do, and I don't need it anymore.
So Mark, what else do you think needs to be present in the second half of life for people to sort of really enjoy themselves and have a sort of fulfilling life that we haven't mentioned already?
Often when you're at the second half of life, you are making a decision. You know, you're making a decision for, I have 15 years, whatever, left of my career. Do I want to spend it the way I've spent the last 15? And I think the people who navigate that the best are the people who are able to answer that question the best, give themselves permission to actually ask that question. And if the answer is yes, great, but not assume that the answer is yes.
And actually, even if the answer is yes, probably in 5 years' time, the answer is going to be probably not. Let's keep changing.
Yeah. Yes. And that growth that's in your North Star. Yes. The fact that we need to allow ourselves to change. We need to allow ourselves to reinvent ourselves throughout the course of our lives.
So, Mark, if you've got people that are, they're not sort of wanting to do a full-blown career change, but they want to put sort of some of this into action because they know something not quite right and they need to shift things around a bit. What would your 3 top quick actions be?
So I think the first thing that one really need to do is that I'm a surgeon, so you'll forgive the phrasing I use for this, but is that dissection of their values. Really take a good look at what you're assuming your values are and ask if that's really what they still are. So you dissect out your values. Number one, these are not quick, unfortunately. These are hard, but I do think people need to do that. I think there's a big mindset shift that we also need to make, which we didn't get time to talk about here, which is we assume that we have no other marketable skills besides medicine, which is incorrect, because to be a good doctor, you have to be a good communicator. You have to be, at least somewhat good with people. You have to, et cetera. You have to be a good systems thinker, et cetera, et cetera. So the second thing that I would tell people to do is to figure out what are the skills that I have that I've learned because I'm a doctor, but I've kind of devalued because they aren't specific to doctoring. And then combine those two and start asking the question, if I want to design for myself more of a portfolio career, so I don't want to leave altogether, but I don't want to do this full time either. If I want to design more of a portfolio career to address the other needs in my North Star 5, what things should I start looking at? And think broadly. I mean, honestly, think broadly. I've given 2 examples already of a cabinet maker and somebody who wants to open a goat farm. Like, we can think, as clinicians have a lot of skills. We can think really broadly around those things.
I love that. And I think also if you sort of add in that thinking of, well, when I'm designing my portfolio career, maybe I'm going to go for the stuff that's more pointing towards that generativity rather than the achievement and the recognition. And yeah, you can do anything. And sometimes just doing something different one day a week is enough, isn't it? It's enough of a change to get you out of burnout, or even just dropping one particular role in your clinical role that's just going to give you a bit more breathing space and head space to be able to do that stuff that you really love, and that will bring you some of that meaning and purpose and stuff, even if you're not paid for it, right?
Totally agreed. And that portfolio career, again, we all do actually have portfolio careers. If we're in the middle of our lives and we're clinicians, we have built a portfolio, but that portfolio is all clinical or all like medical. You can start to add things to that are not as well.
Mark, that's been so interesting. Thank you so much. If people want to find out more about your work or get hold of you, where can they go?
So I have a personal website, which is markschreim.com. I also have a website for the coaching work that I do around specifically this. And there's a free masterclass on that website. And that's Solving for Why, WHY, so solvingforwhy.co. Or you can, find me on the usual social media apps. My handle is the same everywhere. It's just my name, Mark Schreim.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm sure there's loads more stuff we need to talk about, so we'll have to get you back another time just to go down this route even more. And if anyone's got any questions, write in, email us, let us know. And yeah, I do check out all of Mark's resources. And you've done TED Talk as well, I think, Mark, haven't you, which people can watch too. So we'll put all that in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll speak again soon.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks for having me.